Hello everyone, welcome once again to the course Development Economics 2. The current unit is Economic Activity and Climate Change, and this is the second lecture on this unit. In this lecture we are going to learn a few things. Firstly, we will be learning the economic logic behind the environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis. We will also look at some empirical evidence on the EKC hypothesis. We will also look in details on the interrelationship between international trade and environmental quality. And finally, we will be discussing some policy solutions on this issue. First of all, let us have a very quick recap on the environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis. So we have learned that environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis is a inverted U-shaped relationship between economic activity, economic growth and the environmental degradation. Why does this happen? It happens because society attaches higher priority to income and material output growth towards the initial phase of economic growth, and only after attaining a certain level of income, the society starts attaching more and more importance to environmental quality they are living in. This attitude results in some qualitative changes in the economy in favor of less resource intensive production technologies and also in favor of stricter environmental regulations and rules. Now, what is the explanation of environmental Kuznets curve? So, first of all, the income elasticity of demand for environmental quality is said to be positive in the sense that in the initial phase of income growth, people don't value environment that much. But only after attaining a level of income, they start giving importance to the environment they are living in. And this results in adopting cleaner technologies, cleaner lifestyle, so on and so forth. It also affects the overall environmental quality in another channel as well. So when people become more and more affluent, they gain power to influence governments and policymakers towards taking environmental friendly policies. Second thing, the income growth affects environmental quality in three separate channels, right? First of all, let us talk about the scale effect. So what is scale effect? So basically when income grows or material output grows, it basically means more and more natural resource and other inputs are being used in production process, and as we know from microeconomics, more use of input leads to something called economy of scale, right? So it basically means with the same proportion of input, if we increase the absolute amount of inputs, we get more proportion of output as a result of it, right? So as environmental emissions, right, or CO2 emissions or greenhouse gases emissions, these are basically byproducts of the same production process. The scale effect induces higher production of these harmful gases and chemicals into the environment. So scale effect, in the bottom line is the scale effect impacts environment negatively. Now coming to the technology effect, as income grows, economies and policymakers starts being able to adopt better, more efficient technology in one hand and also cleaner technology on the other hand, so that technology effect induces better environmental quality along with higher income growth, right? So thirdly, composition effect. What is composition effect? it says as economy keeps growing, the composition of production in the economy changes. Basically, it means that the production composition changes from more resource intensive production to less natural resource intensive production, and beyond that it changes towards more service based production process. So as we all know, the service sector produces less greenhouse gases than the industrial sector. So as a result, this composition effect improves environmental quality. Now, thirdly, technological progress also helps in improving the environmental quality, right? So technology brings with it greater efficiency, more efficient reuse and recycling of waste materials. It also brings about new technologies that produce environment-friendly goods and services for the use of consumers. And finally, technology benefits the less developed country through the technology diffusion from the more developed countries. The next point is about public spending on research and development on cleaner and greener technologies. It has been observed, some empirical studies have observed that in OECD countries, which are basically high income countries, that after attaining a certain level of high income, public spending in research and development for better and cleaner and greener technology has increased in these countries. So higher income growth has shown to be supporting research and development in greener technology. Finally, innovation and adoption, right? So what do we mean by this? So if we take a particular technology of production in isolation, it can be observed that when a new technology comes, it brings with better efficiency, it also brings about newer kind of wastes which goes into the environment. And because these wastes are new in nature, there are no particular environmental regulation pointed towards these wastes. So initially the environment starts degrading because of a new kind of technology. But after a point, governments become aware of this and they bring about newer regulation to address this problem. And as a result, the curve, if we can imagine an individual EKC curve for this particular technology, the curve starts bending towards the environment, it bends downward, right? So this is kind of a cycle. So as a result of this, newer technology comes to phase out this older technology, right? So this completes a complete cycle, right? So if we can imagine individual EKC curves for individual technologies, then we can imagine the aggregate environmental Kuznets curve to be a envelope of these individual Kuznets curves, right? So this is the basic takeaway from this point. So what does the empirical studies tell us about the economic activity and environmental quality relationship? So all these studies can be, classified based on the kind of indicator they are studying, right? Some studies observe air quality indicator, some studies have observed water quality indicator, and we can classify all other studies into a group called other environmental indicators. So air quality indicator studies have shown that the initial studies on this topic has shown that the inverted U-shaped relationship is true for some some urban and local air quality indicators, but later studies have found that there is no particular relationship between these indicators and economic growth. And in some cases, the studies have found something called a N-shaped relationship between these two, between these indicators and economic growth. Meaning, after having a downward sloping pattern of the environmental degradation, the indicators started having higher pollution level at a higher economic growth level. Secondly, the studies on water quality indicators have mixed results on the relationship between these indicators and income growth. And in case of other environmental indicators, those indicators which have direct impact on livelihood, for example, access to sanitation and clean water, these indicators have improved steadily with economic growth. On the other hand, those indicators which affect livelihood indirectly, these indicators have shown no tendency to decline along with economic growth. Basically, with economic growth, these indirect indicators have worsened and worsened only. Now, here is a question to think. How does international trade affect environmental quality? So, in this section, we will look into the relationship between international trade and environmental quality. So, we will be looking whether trade openness leads to better environmental quality or worse. So, first of all, let us look into empirical evidence. This is a cross-section data of 2011, and on the upper left panel we can see that there is a positive relationship between higher trade volume and carbon dioxide emissions per metric ton per capita, right? So this basically shows that with higher trade volume there is higher level of CO2 emission or higher level of pollution. So remember, this is a correlation, this is not a causation, right? We just see that these two factors overlap in a positive manner. Now we want to look at the reasons behind this. So we will explore the reasons with the help of these other panels. So here on the upper right hand panel we can see that there is also a positive relationship between higher trade volume and GDP per capita. So it basically shows that trade induces higher growth, and as a result it can be argued that this higher growth leads to higher carbon emission. On the lower left hand panel we can see that there is a positive relationship between higher trade volume and the share of industry in an economy. So industry in relation to service sector, industry emits more carbon into the atmosphere. This we all know. So this diagram basically shows that those countries which are more involved in trade have higher share of industry in their economy, right? So this can be another reason. And Finally, the lower right hand side panel shows that there is a positive relationship between the trade volume and carbon dioxide intensity of technologies, right? So this shows that those nations which are involved in more trade have technologies which emits more and more carbon dioxide than other technologies. So let us keep these facts in mind and we will explore the relationship further. So let us first discuss something called the displacement hypothesis, right? So this hypothesis basically says trade enables polluting industries to concentrate in developing countries with low environmental standards, right? So it basically shows that the environmental Kuznets curve or the inverted U-shaped relationship which the developed countries are enjoying is actually the result of distancing themselves from the emissions or the pollution that is being resulted from their own consumption. So for example, empirical studies have shown that in 1960s, environmental emissions, polluting emissions in the OECD countries have rapidly increased. But in the 1970s and 80s, this trend has drastically reversed, which means emissions in these countries have drastically reduced. But at the same time period, in the developing countries, the toxic emissions have exponentially risen. So this phenomena is called the displacement hypothesis, right? Now, first of all, we will discuss, just like we have discussed in the last section, we will discuss the scale effect in the context of international trade. So how does it work? It is argued that higher trade induces higher economic growth, and higher economic growth basically requires higher production, which basically requires more demand for energy, more use of fossil fuel, and as a result of this, more emissions. This is called trade-induced scale effect. Secondly, trade-induced composition effect. So when a country opens up for international trade more and more, this alters the production pattern of an individual country. Why? Because trade, the basis of international trade is something called comparative advantage, right? And comparative advantage basically says that a country will specialize in production of those goods and services in which it has better efficiency, right? So when a country involves in more and more international trade, then it has to focus on those productions in which it is more efficient, irrespective of the environmental implication of those productions, right? So this change induce environmental degradation or improvement through two factors. The first is called the pollution heaven hypothesis, right? So what is pollution heaven hypothesis? It basically says that the developing countries shift their dirty production processes to the countries where the environmental standards are not that stringent, right? And the second hypothesis is called factor endowment hypothesis, and this follows straight from the comparative advantage theory, and it basically says capital abundant countries tend to export capital intensive goods regardless of the differences in environmental policy. And the net composition effect is basically the net effect after counteraction between these two hypotheses, PHH and FEH. And this will decide how much pollution will be generated as a result of international trade in a country. Thirdly, trade-induced technological effect. So this basically says that with more and more trade, newer technology and better technology are being adopted in the economies, and as a result, environmental quality improves. Now this happens through two channels, right? First channel is called the spillover effect, right? So as countries open up to international trade, developed countries tend to bring newer technology to these countries, and as newer technologies are most of the time cleaner technologies than the older ones, environmental quality in these developing countries generally improve. Now the second effect is a bit indirect effect, right? So what happens is environmental quality is considered in economics to be a normal good, which means people, when income increases, people demand more and better environmental quality, right? So when trade openness increases, income increases. As a result, people demand for better and cleaner environment, and this puts pressure on the governments to bring about newer environmental laws which require better technologies or cleaner technologies. So in this way, indirectly, technology effect takes place and improves environmental quality. Now, if we look at the empirical evidence on the subject of effect of international trade on environment, the empirical evidences are mixed in nature. Some empirical studies show that with increased trade, environmental quality has increased, and for other studies have shown that for some indicators the environmental quality has actually decreased. So we cannot conclusively say anything about on this topic. Now here is a question for you to think about. Despite multiple promises, why has the world economy failed to reduce carbon emission? In this section, we will briefly discuss about some climate policies, right? The topic of climate policy is extremely vast and it is not in the scope of this lecture to cover everything. So we will focus on 2-3 things and then we will wrap up. So first of all, the atmosphere can be conceptualized as a common pool resource and greenhouse gas emission as a negative externality. Why? The atmosphere or the environment itself can be used as a waste sink, right, as we have known before, and this function is rival in nature in the sense that use of this dumping more and more environmentally damaging goods in waste in the atmosphere reduces the availability of this resource to other potential polluters, right? And on the other hand, this function is free to use for everyone. Whoever comes first pollutes the atmosphere. So in this respect, it is a common pool resource. And greenhouse gas emission, on the other hand, is a form of externality in the sense that it is a byproduct, unintended byproduct of usual production process, but this affects the whole economy or the world itself. So there is negative externality faced by everyone else in the economy. So this leads to market failure because the prices and economic activity or the economic system cannot capture this externality in their prices. As a result, the market fails. So market cannot give a solution to the problem of climate change. This means that only policy intervention can mitigate the problem of climate change. Climate change policies can be thought of as a global public good. So if some climate action or new climate regulation is taken up, it benefits all the countries, all the nations in the world, right? So these benefits are non-excludable in nature and also non-rival in nature. Hence, we are calling this as a global public good. Now, because this is a global public good, there is always a possibility and there is always incentive for individual nations to free ride on the action taken by other government or the international bodies. For example, it is easy to walk out of a Paris Agreement and still enjoy the benefit of the actions taken by the other nations. This is called the free rider problem. Now, the puzzle here is that we have seen historically many international high-level meeting has been conducted on climate change. Many treaties have been signed between multiple countries. Many promises have been made to control, reduce the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. But the historical experience shows that we have failed, or the world has failed to arrest the increase of greenhouse gas emission and the pattern or the path of climate change, right? So why is this happening? So the world is adopting a concept of sustainable development to combat climate change in this respect, but there are some problems in the approach, in this approach, right? The current approach which is being taken up by the governments. So there are many aspects to this approach, but we will focus on one aspect of it today. So this is called, there is something called technocentrism. This approach, the approach of technocentrism, says that technology can and will ultimately provide all the solutions to the climate change, and we will reverse the trend of climate change only depending on technology, right? But the problem in this is the fact that the underlying assumption in this argument is that the humanity or the societies, human societies will not or cannot change the lifestyle they are having. They will not, the public will always resist a change, right? But the core of the problem is the energy demand the human society makes, right? So why is this a problem? So when one very central argument of technocentrism is that technology brings in more and more efficiency. Newer technology means better efficiency, right? But we have seen that something called rebound effect as a result of better technology. For example, a study of energy consumption or energy demand for air conditioners in United States have shown that in a time period when air conditioners have became around 25% more efficient in their energy consumption, in the same time period, people have consumed 31% higher energy in terms of air conditioner energy consumption. So as a result of higher efficiency, people end up, in lot of cases, people end up using the technology so much that the benefit of higher efficiency gets completely lost. So this is just an example. This can be observed in case of many other technologies which bring in better efficiency or cleaner technologies. So the core of the problem we have to understand is that the energy demand we are making. We cannot keep demanding the same level of energy and expect that we will be able to reverse climate change. The only policy solution which can manage energy demand by the humanity will result in a better climate change policy. So what are the take-home points of this lecture? First of all, we have learnt about the explanation of the environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis. Secondly, we have looked at the interrelationship between international trade, more trade openness, and environmental quality. And finally, we have looked at some policy solutions of this problem. I will see you in another lecture. Thank you.